Good evening, everybody. Well, last night we talked about the 11 p.m. deadline that was looming. Remember, Dominic Grieve got this vote through Parliament demanding that by 11 o'clock last night that government documents surrounding a no-deal Brexit were published fully. But interestingly, his motion also demanded that communications, formal or informal, including WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal, Facebook, Messenger, even private email accounts, text messages from senior officials involved in the process working in Number 10, that all of that should be submitted by 11 o'clock tomorrow night. Now, he didn't ask for full body strip searches. I'm quite surprised they didn't really, but it did strike me that it was pretty remarkable. And I was speculating last night with LBC senior reporter Matthew Thompson as to whether all of this information would be submitted or not. And I think, Matthew, we were sceptical that it would be. So what happened?
Well, what happened was we got half of the information, if you like. There were obviously two aspects to the humble address that Dominic Grieve got passed in Parliament at the beginning of the week. Part of it was to do with these text messages. Part of it was to do with Operation Yellowhammer, the no-deal planning documents. Yeah. And so the no-deal planning document under Yellowhammer, a 6-page document, was indeed published. It was uploaded at about 8 o'clock last night to the government's website. The other half of it, possibly the more interesting half that we were discussing last night about the text messages, the WhatsApp conversations from Dominic Cummings and his ilk, that wasn't so forthcoming. I have here a letter from Michael Gove to Dominic Grieve, who was the sort of lead signatory to that humble address, trying to get this information. And it's quite lengthy, and it goes into all of the reasons why the government was refusing this humble address. Michael Gove says it's an unprecedented use of the humble address procedure. And it comes down to this, Nigel. He's sort of saying, well, look, advisors advise, ministers decide. It's Parliament's role. To quote
Margaret Thatcher.
Indeed. It's Parliament's role to hold ministers to account for their decisions, but it's not necessarily right that the entire decision-making process is thrown open to the world to see. And possibly more significantly than that, he goes on to say that the government believes that it's actually in breach of the Investigatory Powers Act, the Human Rights Act, implementing the European Convention on Human Rights, and indeed the Data Protection Act, to publish personal information like this from government.
Ironic for a Brexit government to quote the European Convention on Human Rights, I would have thought.
Better for you to point it out, but yes, indeed.
But anyway, so a pretty robust defence by Michael Gove, and I have to say, I think the right one. Otherwise, what are the limits to this? What are the punishments for defying Parliament?
Well, that's an interesting one. So last night we discussed the last humble address, which was used to get Geoffrey Cox, the then Attorney General, to publish legal advice on the withdrawal agreement, and they didn't do that. And then there was a vote fairly quickly afterwards last December to hold the government in contempt of Parliament. It's the first time that's ever happened. There was a big brouhaha. They then eventually turned around and they did publish the documents. The first thing to say about that is Parliament's prorogued, so there's no Parliament to vote on contempt.
At the moment.
At the moment,
yeah.
Until it comes back. The second thing to say is it's not entirely clear what the punishment is for being in contempt of Parliament. Now, there are old laws. Parliament used to have the ability to imprison people. I go back as far as 1666 was the last time they fined anyone for being in contempt. But in 1880, someone was imprisoned in the Clock Tower for being in contempt of Parliament. Now, I don't think Boris Johnson is about to be locked in the Clock Tower by Dominic Grieve.
Well, he'd like to, I'm sure.
But those powers have now lapsed, more or less. So it's not quite clear what the punishment would be for being in contempt of Parliament. Mostly punishments tend to be MPs being summoned to the chamber for reprimands. There was some discussion I saw online about possible expulsions from the chamber, things like that. I don't know. It seems to me that there has been previously to all of this discussion about whether the powers for Parliament to hold people in contempt should be given a statutory footing basis in law. At the moment, they don't really have one.
So
it feels like nothing much is going to happen.
Yellowhammer's been released, although of course it was leaked by the Sunday Times weeks ago. And folks, tonight we're going to discuss Yellowhammer and whether it worries you or not. But one more thing I want to pick up on, and that was the judgment of the Court of Session in Edinburgh yesterday, which very much contradicted what the High Court in London had said the week before. And next Tuesday, we understand, the Supreme Court will look at this. It may not judge on Tuesday, but it begins its process of thinking about it. Now, the information that's come out is that At no point did Boris Johnson or any senior civil servant put into the Court of Session any explanation or rationale as to their motive. And I want to ask you, Matthew, is that being viewed as them themselves being contemptuous of the court process, or is Downing Street just not working? Is it just inefficient?
So what they failed to provide was a sworn witness statement from someone saying this is the reason why.
And it could have been Boris.
It could have been Boris, it could have been a civil servant, it could have been anyone who was prepared to put their name to a document. The reason that's caused controversy is that some people say, well, it's one thing to say on the BBC or on LBC, you know, we did this because we want to have a Queen's speech and introduce a new legislative agenda. If you put it in a witness statement and in a sworn affidavit in court, you're then guilty of perjury if it subsequently emerges that you've been lying. So the stakes are an awful lot higher if you submit a witness statement to court. So there are those who are speculating, you could decide whether it's justly or not, that the reason the government hasn't done this is because it doesn't want information to come out subsequently that might have Boris Johnson perjuring himself in front of a court. Now, in the absence
of that... So that leaves them with a huge decision, doesn't it? Will they put a witness statement into the Supreme Court or not?
Indeed, but they might be relying on the fact that the Supreme Court will side with the English and Northern Irish judges who have each in their subsequent court cases said that this is just, regardless of the rights or wrongs of whether Boris lied or not, it doesn't matter, because this is, as they say in the legal jargon, not justiciable. This is not a matter for the courts. This is a political matter. The Scottish courts is slightly different legal system, and they have judged that this is unlawful based on... Well, it's probably too much to get into the differences in jurisprudence between English law and Scots law, but the government decision might be to continue not to submit an affidavit or a witness statement on the assumption that the Supreme Court sides with the English judges.
Risky game.
Well, potentially it is. And therefore, also, we should probably be fair to the government, that is a interpretation largely being put about by their opponents. The government would say that that's not the reason they didn't submit an affidavit, but they haven't quite yet answered the question as to why they didn't.
Extraordinary. Matthew Thompson, thank you very much indeed. Well, Operation Yellowhammer was released in full. I mean, hang on, it was almost identical to what we'd seen in the Sunday Times a few weeks ago. Just to remind ourselves, with a no-deal Brexit, there could be protests and counter-protests. Channel goods, the flow could be reduced down to 40% of what it currently is. Lorries could be queuing for 2 to 2.5 days. There could be shortages of some types of food. And it goes on and on. A rise in inflation. Food prices will go up. Citizens may find travelling difficult. A hard border may be impossible to avoid. Fishing vessels could start to enter our waters illegally. I thought they were already. And so on and so forth. No great shock that Yellowhammer was released. As I say, we'd seen it all before weeks ago, and yet it's been dominating the news today in what I have to call the mainstream media. I just do. Let's hear Prime Minister Boris Johnson responding to Operation Yellowhammer.
It's very important to understand what this document is. This is a worst-case scenario, which civil servants obviously have to prepare for. But in the last few months, and particularly in the 50 days since I've been Prime Minister, we've been massively accelerating our preparations. We're trying to get a deal. I'm very hopeful that we will get a deal with our European friends on October the 17th or 18th or thereabouts. But if we have to come out on October the 31st with no deal, we will be ready. And the ports will be ready, and the farming communities will be ready, and all the industries that matter will be ready for a no-deal Brexit.
So Boris making the point, this was done a long time ago, a huge amount of work's been done, indeed, a point that's been very much backed up today by the leader of Kent County Council, and listen, there isn't too much to worry about. Also worth listening to Rosamond Irwin from the Sunday Times, because she was the one that originally got the Yellowhammer leak back in August, and she was talking to LBC this morning.
So they're essentially the same document, but with the heading changed, and my version didn't have the redacted part. The heading of my version says base scenario in big capital letters. Now the new one says Her Majesty's Government reasonable worst case planning assumption. So I agree that these are the planning assumptions. But that part has definitely changed between when we got hold of this document at the Sunday Times and this publication of it.
Well, it's the worst case scenario, and equally we could, of course, have a worst case scenario for bad weather. No, I'm not joking, because if we get 3 days of force 10 gales in the channel, things get seriously backed up at either end. Operation Stat kicks in, and anyone in Kent listening knows they've seen major delays before through strikes, bad weather. But it's out there. I want to ask you, does the full publication of this report change your opinion? And if you think, oh, if only I'd known this, I wouldn't have voted Brexit. Or maybe you think, as I do, it isn't just Project Fear Mark 2, it's Project Fear times 2. Do you actually think our civil service are neutral and independent in producing a report like this? Mick on Facebook says, Yellowhammer is for the birds. Very good, I like that. Karen says, the basic reason for leaving still exists in spite of Yellowhammer. I have to say, Yellowhammer has been produced by a group of pen pushers in Whitehall who've never bought or sold or traded a good or shipped a good in their lives. And the truth of it is, outside the customs union, all we have to do is one piece of documentation. And you can do it physically if you want to, or you can do it increasingly online at borders all over the world. It is nonsense. It is fear-mongering, scaremongering on the most extraordinary scale. But if you think I've got this wrong, if you think that leaving the European Union means it might take 3 days to get a lorry through Dover, tell me why on 0345 6060 973, because thus far nobody has made this case to me that I've been convinced by.